Today's text comes from the book of Acts in the New Testament. It is the fifth book after the Gospels, chapter 9, verses 1 through 14. 10 through 14. Acts chapter 9, verses 10 through 14. Now, there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." And he answered, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying, and he has had a vision of a man named Ananias come and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who invoke your name." The word of the Lord. Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9 is of great significance to us as the church because it is the conversion story of a man named Saul, who later becomes Paul, and whose theology is what has led us to the church as it exists today. Paul is the major writer of the New Testament, where most of the letters that are in the New Testament come from this apostle, this brother, this Christian brother. But his story is not as simple as just someone who converted and said, "I want to do this, I want to follow this Jesus," and then he started writing and everything was awesome. In fact, it starts off pretty grim. His story is one of a zealous person, a very religious person. And as I often state in my Bible studies, and I've stated here also, he was a Pharisee. And in the time of Jesus and after, the Pharisees are the antagonists of the story because they're the ones who suppress or who are weary of people like Jesus and others who proclaim something that may cause trouble. So they serve as the antagonists. But in fact, they're not bad people. Often we have, like when we hear a story, we need bad guys and we need good guys. The Pharisees aren't necessarily bad guys. They're just weary and aware that what they're doing in Jerusalem can cause the Roman Empire to come upon them and destroy it. So they're trying to prevent the destruction of their culture, of their city, of their people. So you can see that they weren't just bad guys. Now, did they do bad things? Paul was one of the people, one of the zealots, who was pushing forward an agenda to eliminate this movement that had begun. They thought that with the death of its leader, the person who they thought was the Messiah, they thought that if they eliminated Jesus, the movement would end. They didn't count on Jesus dying and then getting up again on Sunday morning. They didn't see that coming. So this movement that continued, they want to finish squashing it. And so this religious zealot, this religious person who was very, very zealous for God. Paul didn't do the things he did in anyone else's name. He did it in God's name. So when he stood there and watched as they stoned Stephen, one of the first apostles and disciples, as they stoned him, he stood there and was aware of what was happening and was okay with it. In fact, he was so okay that he went to the chief priests and asked for paperwork that allowed him to go into people's houses who they suspected were followers of this Jesus character. And he went into their houses and pulled them out and took them to trial for treason against God. He was that zealous for God. This is the Saul or Paul that comes to or is heading towards Damascus. He's heading to Damascus with a letter in hand that gives him the authority to go in and take people out of their houses, to pull people and make sure that they're following the Jewish law the way they're supposed to. He has the authority to force people to stop following this Jesus character and start following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob like they're supposed to. But something happened on this road to Damascus. Saul ran into someone that he wasn't expecting. And if we read the first part of chapter 9, we see that as Saul is heading towards Damascus, a great light comes into being. And if you've ever seen any picture of it, they show him falling from his horse. So God almost literally made him fall from his high horse in order to see and to hear what he was doing. And he has the ability to see what's going on. And the first thing he says is he calls Jesus Sir or Lord, for Jesus had appeared before him. And Jesus calls him by name and says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul says, Lord, who are you? And he says, I am Jesus, the one whom you persecute. A drastic conversion for a zealous man. And if we take these chapters from chapter 8 to chapter 10, if we look at them for what they are the stories of conversions that were unexplainable or unable for people to understand. A few weeks ago, we preached on chapter 8, the Samaritan's conversion with the Ethiopian man. Here we have Paul. In the next chapter, we see Peter and Cornelius, a Roman sentry. This is the change and the shift in Christianity in these 3 chapters, with the center chapter being about Paul, the person who is so influential in all of our lives, whether we know it or not. As Christians, Paul is very influential. And if you've been with me in Bible study, you know I often say I wrestle with Paul because of some of the things that he said and how he said them. But that doesn't deny the fact of his importance for our Christian faith. But that's Paul's story. Our text today, yes, it's about Paul. But there's another character in there that we know nothing about or very little about. A person who appears and then disappears, and we never see him again. And it's this brother called Ananias. And Ananias is praying, and God speaks to him. And like the prophets of old, when God calls him by name, he answers, "Here I am." So now let's put this in context maybe that we can understand a little better. God wants him to go speak to this man, to go to the house where this man who has the authority to take people who believe in Jesus out of their houses and force them to convert back to the pure Jewish faith. This man who was coming to Damascus specifically to oppress those who believed in this Jesus. Now God is speaking to Ananias and saying, I want you to go speak to him. Can you relate? There's something that I don't want to do, but yet God is calling me to do exactly what I don't want to do. How would you feel? How would you feel if you had the call to go speak to someone that you cannot relate to at all, to speak to someone who you completely disagree with, to speak to someone or minister to someone who quite literally can cause you physical harm? How would you feel if God called you to speak to them? And we see that Ananias doesn't just say, okay, he says, Lord, I've heard a lot about this guy. I've heard how evil he is and the things he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and now he has the authority to bind all who invoke your name. So he's not going very easily. But yet God says, go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before the Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. This person is the one that will take my word beyond the borders of where we've seen. This Paul will be an influence beyond. And so Ananias goes and he enters the house. And there is Paul praying, and Ananias comes and places hands on him and prays for him. And because of the light and because of what had happened on the road to Damascus, Paul was blind. He couldn't see. But when Ananias comes, his eyes are opened, and it looks like scales falling from his eyes. We don't know exactly what scales look like or what they would be, but I imagine them to be something like crust or crustiness falling from his eyes, and he was opened, and now he can see once again. But now the Saul who fell off of his high horse and was here to destroy the faith of Jesus is now Paul, the disciple and theologian for Jesus to the Gentiles. He was converted and changed. And this man, Ananias, the one who was called to pray with him and for him, was a big part of that. And I want us to focus on Ananias for a minute because his importance can't be played down and shouldn't be played down. Because too often we think that our roles are so small, they won't make a difference. Oh, God is calling me to pray for this person. That's not very important. That's just minimal. That's nothing. But yet this person goes on to become Paul, the writer of most of the books in the New Testament. How could that be nothing? And I think for too many of us, we think our worth and our importance is so minimal and so little that we don't do the things that we should do because I'm not that important, or I don't know that much, or I don't know enough. Or maybe we have plenty of excuses. I know all of us can be excuse machines when we need to be, excuse factories when we have to be or when we want to be. But it can't be minimized, the importance of this, because it was important that this person, Ananias, do what he did in order for Paul to become who he becomes. It was important for this person, Ananias, to be the one. And the thing is, God could have called someone else, but that person could not have done it the same way as Ananias because it was Ananias' call to do what he did and how he did it. And too often we fall into that. God will send somebody else. I don't feel I'm well equipped. I'm not smart enough. I'm not whatever excuse I come up with. Someone else can do it. And yes, the work can be done by someone else. But if God has called you, it is because of who you are. It is because of what you bring. It is because of all the things that you have been through. And that's the reason God is calling you to do that. Because the person will be blessed the way they need to be blessed because it is you. The work can be done by someone else, but it is your work. It is your call. It is your specific calling to do this specific thing on purpose because of who you are, because of what God has made you. The experiences you've been through, the life that you've lived, the jobs that you've had, all of these things that have made you who you are today is why God calls you to do the things that you are called to do. So we cannot minimize that. Ananias was specifically called because of who he was, because of what he had done. So let's imagine for a minute if Ananias says, no, send someone else. I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can I can be that person. Now let's take it to an extreme case. So Ananias runs away and someone else does it. Maybe that leads to Paul not becoming Paul completely. Maybe he converts for a little while. Maybe he doesn't become the writer that he should have been because of this one step. Maybe he only writes half the letters that he writes in the New Testament. Obviously this is an extreme case, but we don't know. That's why it's important that if it is up to you, if God has called you, if it is your call to do something, do it. You are worthy. You are capable. You are the reason why God is calling you. We can't minimize that. If Ananias decides to run away, maybe we don't have the New Testament that we have today. Maybe we don't become the church that it needs to be. Maybe it becomes something different, and maybe it fades away or becomes something minimal that doesn't influence the world in the millennia to come. Ananias was called on purpose. God is calling you on purpose. God is calling you for a reason. God is not making a mistake. Because Ananias comes in, because Ananias is who he is, because of what Ananias has gone through, he's able to pray for his brother there. And he calls him brother from the start. He says, Brother Paul. He pulls him into the family. He welcomes him from persecutor of the faith to brother, family, part of the faith. He brings him into the fold. He brings him into the family and to the believers of Christ and prays for him. And because of his prayer, because of his bringing Paul before God, because of how he prayed with him and for him, Paul's eyes were opened, the scales fell from his eyes, and he was able to see once again, this time rising from the ashes of what was and who was Saul into the apostle and the Christian person called Paul. We cannot minimize the importance of one Ananias. And you don't have to be a person who remains on the scene forever. I've often shared the story of the person who helped me with my speech. When I was in high school, when I was struggling, when I couldn't say my SH and CH for all of my school years, from birth until 16 years of age, this person appeared because they saw my records at school and realized I needed speech class. After 3 years of high school, they finally brought someone in. And this person never worked for the Board of Ed. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a person who was part of the system. There was someone that came in from the corporate world. She worked with CEOs and people of importance, and she sat me down for a year and helped me to say my CH and SH. So that I can stand here before you today, able to speak publicly in a way that I could never have done if I was still struggling with my speech. She came for a short time. I can't remember her name or what she looked like, but I thank God that she came into my life at exactly the right time. She was exactly the right person. She was exactly where she needed to be. And she was there specifically because God had called her there for me. Ananias was that to Paul. Exactly the person he needed at exactly the right time for exactly the right purpose because of who he was. God is calling you for situations like that. God is calling you to be this person. God is calling you to be this person here in church and there in your life, in your family, in your friends, at your work, wherever you go. God is calling you to be that person because there are people with impaired vision. There are people who can't see. There are people who need us to pray for their blindness so that the scales can fall off of their eyes. so that the scales can fall and they can be free to see once again, even here at church, even here at Lower Merion, as we continue doing what we're doing, as we're continuing to do ministry, as we're moving forward, moving from what we were and what was going on to what God is calling us to do and how God is calling us to do it. As we pray with and for each other, we're praying so that the scales can fall from our eyes. The scales of shame need to fall off of our eyes. The scales of guilt need to fall from our eyes. The scales of your past need to fall from your eyes. They're blinding you. The scales of what was and how it used to be need to fall from your eyes. The scales of indifference need to be removed from your eyes. The scales of gossip, the scales of pride, the scales of things that are holding you back. The time is now to let them fall from your eyes. It's time to stop being blinded by these things. It's time that you let the scales fall from your eyes. Stop making excuses for them. God is trying to take the scales off of your eyes. It's time that we respond, yes. Yes, Lord, please take these scales off of my eyes. Yes, yes, Lord, please help me to remove the scales off of my brother and my sister's eyes. It's time to do the work that God has called you to do because of who you are. It's time to respond to the call because of what you have been through, where you have been, how you got here. That is why God is calling you, because of who and what you are. It is now time.